Welcome to June. I consider this the honeymoon period in the garden. All the hard work of planting is done, the crops have started to settle in and grow, and we've even gotten some harvest. But while our gardens will often look content and lush and happy, this is not the time to get lazy. While June is not as demanding as some of the other months, there's still work to be done. Work that can help keep our gardens healthy and productive. So, whether you are listening in your garden or you're on the go or doing something else, just sit back and relax and let's talk about some of the tasks that you can be doing and things to watch out for in your June garden. Welcome to the Beginner's Garden Podcast. I'm Jill and I'm so glad you're here. In this podcast, you'll find easy to understand conversations about how to grow your own food. As a first-time gardener myself 11 years ago, I remember what it's like to feel overwhelmed. So I want to make gardening so doable for you that you'll find yourself falling in love with gardening just like I did. Let's dig in. The first thing I want us to look at is how are our cool season crops doing? Now, this, of course, will depend on where you're growing. If you are in the furthest of the south, you're probably long past this. I know most of my cool season crops have already started to bolt and suffer. And if you're further to the north, you may be able to grow cool season crops all year. But for many of us, we will start to see these signs of especially our leafy greens starting to struggle. Keep an eye out for bolting lettuce, bolting cilantro, bolting spinach. And in some of these cases, lettuce in particular, you're going to start seeing some bitterness coming from those leaves. Now, here are some things that you want to keep an eye out for, especially with lettuce. When the temperatures start to climb, when the day length starts to get longer, if you start to notice that your lettuce, which is typically pretty compact and maybe grows wide, when it starts growing a little bit taller, if you look a little bit closely, you'll be able to see a central stalk that's starting to form, and the leaves are going to start coming off of that central stalk. Now, it depends on how quickly that you catch this. What I have noticed is that if I catch it quick enough, many times I can still harvest some of those leaves and it not be very bitter. Sometimes, though, in the middle, what I have found is that the spine part of the leaf, I know there's a better word for this, but it's escaping me right now. But the middle part of it that is crisp, that tends to get bitter the quickest. So a lot of times I can just peel off the soft part of the leaf from that center and still be able to harvest and still be able to eat. But here's the thing that you need to know is that once that central stalk starts to form, the plant has entered not necessarily bolting, it may be bolting, but it may just be starting its regular reproduction of where it's going to start developing flowers to eventually develop seeds. And what that means for the leaves is they're not going to be tasty anymore. So keep an eye out for that. Eventually, I have to pull out my lettuce altogether. Know that there's nothing you can do to stop this. Once the plant starts to shift into reproduction mode, then it's not going to go back. You can't stop this. It's what happens. Cilantro usually starts to bolt earlier than lettuce. It is very tender to hot weather. And if you need the space, it's a good idea to go ahead and take the cilantro out so that you can put something else in its place. But if you don't necessarily have a need for that space in particular, you can leave that cilantro and let it start to flower. It's a very good host plant for lots of beneficial insects. So cilantro is something you might want to keep in your garden if you are okay with leaving it there and you don't have something else that you need to put in its place. If you continue letting it flower, it will start to develop seeds. These are also known as coriander seeds, and you can harvest them for coriander. I've definitely done that before. Or you can just let the seeds drop naturally, and when the time is right, they will start to grow volunteer plants. They'll start to grow new cilantro. And because cilantro is a cool season crop, you probably won't even notice this happening until the fall, which is perfect because that's when cilantro wants to grow best anyway, and you'll probably be able to get a better harvest the second time around if you let those seeds mature and fall. So those are a couple of options for cilantro. Spinach also bolts earlier than lettuce and many times earlier than cilantro, kind of depends on the season and also whether you've overwintered it or not. The good part about spinach is that once you notice it starts bolting, the leaves of spinach, at least in my experience, don't become bitter. Now, they're not as great of a quality, and they are definitely switching into reproduction mode. So you're at the tail end of your harvest period. But once you start seeing that little stalk, the little flower forming, go ahead and harvest that spinach and eat it because it's definitely going into reproduction mode. So those are the things that you want to keep an eye out for cool season crops if they have already started to shift to reproduction mode and you can't go back. But if you get into the warmer part of the season, and for me that normally has already happened in May, but for many of you that'll happen in June, and your lettuce hasn't started to bolt, but it's large and mature, and maybe you've got heat coming in the mid 80s, you might want to consider shading these crops. What this may do is it may buy you some time. It may buy you a week or 2 weeks so that you can still get great quality leaves before they start to bolt or to shift into that reproduction mode. So keep an eye on your weather. If you've got great lettuce in the 80s or coming, then consider shading it to get a little bit longer out of that harvest. Now, for both leafy greens and for any other crops that are they've just kind of overstayed their welcome, maybe you're growing peas and it's too hot, they're not producing anymore. Or it could even be flowers. I know usually the beginning of July, not quite yet, nasturtium starts to really look bad. Calendula starts to look bad, at least in my climate. It doesn't like our Arkansas heat. Then I'm going to take them out. So remove any spent cool season crops that are just not going to make it through the summer, because what you want to do is you want to allow your garden space to be able to be filled with summer crops that are going to thrive in the summer and give you more of a harvest, or even flowers that are going to excel in the heat rather than not do so well in the heat. So the first thing you want to do in June is to evaluate your cool season crops and make decisions accordingly. The second thing that you're going to start doing is harvesting. Now, I don't really have to tell you to harvest probably what's available in your garden to harvest, but there are a couple of things that you might want to consider and keep on your radar for this time of year. June is a great time to start harvesting your perennial herbs, and you do this partly to encourage new growth, but also partly because this is a great time to harvest them for fresh use, obviously, but also preserving for drying. This is a time of year before it gets too hot that they are in peak condition to be able to dry and preserve however you want for the best flavor. I love to harvest my oregano, my sage. Those are the ones that are going to be really good this time of year before it gets too hot. Peppermint, lemon balm, anything like that, they're going to do fine over the summer. They're mostly going to survive just fine, but their best quality is going to be now. I would recommend not to harvest more than a third of the plant at a time, although some plants can be a little bit more resilient, especially those in the mint family, like peppermint, oregano. You could get away with harvesting a little bit more than that. I know I definitely have, but this is a really great time to harvest those perennial herbs. Herbs such as basil in particular, you want to keep an eye out for them right now. And again, many of us, this started in May, to prune basil. Unless you grow a variety like everleaf basil that has it bred into it where it won't go to flower, you're going to want to prune basil regularly so it doesn't go to flower. This is the natural life cycle of basil. It grows all the beautiful, tasty basil leaves, and then it starts to shift to start developing flowers, which the bees absolutely love. But once it starts to do that, the quality of the basil leaves will decline. So if you want to have basil all summer long and have good quality basil, then you want to prune them back. And what you're looking for is you'll see the basil in this rosette type cluster, and then you can just pick that at the base, at the stem. And then at the base, there's 2 more stems that are going to come out from that. Those will continue to create new leaves. So as long as you continue pruning, you're going to be able to buy yourself more and more time to get good quality basil. I don't know about you, but I love basil in the middle of the summer with my tomatoes to be able to make bruschetta and all sorts of things. Tomatoes and basil just go so well together. But for most of us, we're not harvesting tomatoes quite yet. We may be starting to harvest in June, depending on your location, but For me, most of my tomato harvest comes in July. And if you're even further north than me, probably not till August. So you want to keep those basil plants pruned and healthy so that you can use them when you want them the most. Now, if you planted a lot of basil plants, you may want to let a few of them go to flower because, again, they are amazing for bees. They're great to attract bees, especially in the middle of the summer when the bees don't have as much nectar. And so what I like to do is keep 1 or 2 pruned so that I can harvest off of that. And then the rest of them I usually will let go to flower for the pollinators. Another thing to keep an eye out for as far as harvesting goes is if you're in a southern area in particular, this is the time of year that I start to harvest most of my root crops, like onions, garlic, beets, and potatoes. Every single year, I'm usually harvesting them in June, sometimes early June, sometimes late June, just depending on the season and when I got things planted. A lot of times there is some variation, but for the most part, that's when these root crops are going to be harvesting. I can also harvest carrots in June in many cases. Sometimes they go into July. Again, just kind of depends on the season. But I tell you this because root crops are different than fruiting crops. If you have a cucumber, you pretty much can see when it's ready to harvest. But for a root crop, it's not always easy to know exactly when it's ready. So I just want to kind of put that on your radar to be looking at these crops. Be looking for garlic. You want half of the leaves to have started to brown before you can harvest it. So be looking for that. You don't want to wait till all of them are brown because they won't store as well. For onions, you want to wait for the tops to fall over. Beets are a little bit harder. That's really hard to figure out when to harvest, but a lot of times I'll just look at the size of the beet that's kind of poking out of the ground and decide if it's the size that I want. And then potatoes, they will die back naturally. Many people are like, what's wrong with my potatoes? Well, they're dying back naturally because they're focused on producing the potato underground. And then once they completely die back, give it a couple of weeks if you're trying to store, and then they will be better quality for storage when you do it that way. Now, if you want to just harvest some for dinner, you don't have to wait for all that. You can do that really at any time. But if you're wanting to store it a little bit longer, you want to wait a couple of weeks till after the potatoes die back to harvest them. But again, many of you will probably be doing this in July or even later. But for those of you who are in similar climates in me, I know there's many listening that are. I just wanted to let you know that harvesting right now, some of those root crops will be something that you want to look at this month and just keep an eye on. The next thing you want to do, especially since we're talking about harvesting, we're talking about harvesting cool season crops, root crops, taking some out that are spent. This is a great time to keep planting. I know most of my planting is done in March and April. March for my cool season crops, April for my warm season crops. And in June, there's usually not a whole lot on my calendar to plant unless you have gone through my online course, Dream to Garden, which I teach you how to plan that all out. But if you haven't yet and you don't really know what you want to plant next, keep planting. So some ideas would be beans, such as bush beans, and even early in June, depending on your season, you could probably get away with pole beans this early. Okra is a great option for you to plant this time of year. Sweet potatoes, melons, anything, cucumbers, anything like this that likes the heat or can handle the heat. This is a really good time to plant these crops after those cool season crops come out. You can sow quick growing crops. Again, bush beans are fantastic for this. I have found that in the middle of the summer, my bush beans come to harvest a lot quicker when I'm planting them. Usually in June or July, they come to harvest faster, probably because of the daylight. So those quick growing crops like bush beans or cucumbers are a great idea. And then you can also start direct sowing if you haven't yet, pumpkins, even winter squash, because they're going to be long season growers. If you haven't started sowing those yet, this is a good time to do that as well. Another thing to consider, and this is something I've been playing around with over the past couple of years to actually really good success, is try planting more cool season greens, but plant them in the shade. I like to do this on the north side of my green stock planter where I know it's going to get some shade. I also have a planter that's closer to the house, so I know it's getting morning shade. And so those are actually more successful because they're in the shade most of the time in the heat. And obviously they're getting a lot more water. But last year I also experimented with doing this under shade cloth in a raised bed. Now, the only thing you need to keep an eye on if you do this is try to make it where there's plenty of airflow, because even a shade cloth, especially if it's just like 12 inches off the ground on a hoop, that can trap heat, and that's definitely not what you want. You want to cool the area. So make sure that there's plenty of airflow. When I put the shade cloth on, in this situation, I just put it on top or even on the south side and then toward the top. And often I'll keep the north side open because it's not going to get a lot of sun from there, or I'll keep the east and west sides open for airflow. So keep that in mind. But planting some cool season crops in the shade will allow you to get more of those greens that you love and grow them at a time of the year when you might not have been able to in the past. Now, one thing to keep in mind that you do have to adjust, especially if you live in a really hot climate like we do, then you're going to need to expect to harvest them when they're younger. You're going to want to harvest these leaves like 3-4 inches. And I know basically you're getting baby greens. And yes, you have to plant multiple times because you're harvesting more and you're harvesting smaller, but you're also harvesting quicker. And as you're planting throughout the season, you just continue to get these baby greens. My favorite is arugula. I found that this is a really great option for the summer, but I've also done it with lettuce, mesclun greens. As long as I'm not expecting the big romaine and just cutting them for baby greens, it's a great way to get your salad greens in the middle of the summer. Just taking a quick break to thank our sponsor. By the time June rolls around, most of us have our gardens planted, but that doesn't mean it's too late to keep building healthy soil and stronger plants. That's why I keep reaching for Organic REV all season long. In June, I use REV in a few different ways. I water it into my raised beds around established plants to boost microbial life and help roots absorb nutrients more efficiently. I also use it when I'm succession planting. Anytime I tuck in a new seedling, I dip the root ball in a REV and water mixture before planting. It really helps get those late season crops off to a strong start. REV improves moisture retention too, which is a huge help as the summer heat ramps up. Healthier soil means healthier plants, better resilience to stress, and ultimately, a bigger harvest. If you want to give your garden a boost this summer, head to organicrev.com and use my code Jill10 to save on your order. Your plants will thank you all season long. Again, organicrev.com and use my promo code Jill10 to save 10%. And as always, the links are in the show notes. Now back to wrap up our June garden checklist. Let's talk now about something that's not so much fun to talk about or to do, but it really is necessary, and that is to focus on maintenance and upkeep. I think this is the place where many of us start to get a little bit behind because it's not as fun or enjoyable as the planning and the planting part. But if we're going to make it through the whole season without getting more burned out than is normal, then we want to keep on top of the maintenance and the upkeep. The first thing that I would recommend is to mulch. Mulching is so important for many reasons. I've done several podcast episodes on that. But the main two reasons would be to conserve moisture and to suppress weeds. Now let's talk about suppressing weeds, because this is where I think a lot of our gardens get out of control really quickly. And this is something that we want to really stay on top of in June, because as the summer solstice approaches at the end of June, we know that plants are growing like crazy just because we're getting more and more daylight, and weeds are no exception. Weeds then are going to be what we really need to stay on top of. Now, we want to obviously make time to pull weeds that get out of control, pull them in areas that we haven't mulched yet, and try to keep on top of them as much as possible. There's no way we're going to eliminate weeding altogether, but it's really good to try to at least stay ahead of the curve to some degree so that the garden doesn't get out of control. And side note, this is one reason why I really love gardening in raised beds. I can't remember who asked me, but someone asked me recently, why raised beds over ground beds? And I mean, ground beds are just fine. I grew in them for many years. I'm really not growing in them much this year, but it's the weeding. There's just not as much weeding for a raised bed in my experience. And so it's just not as much work in general. But whether you're doing a raised bed, whether you're doing a container, weeds can get in containers too, just again, not as much, or you're in a ground bed, stay on top of weeding. But to prevent weeding from becoming the only thing that you're doing in your garden, because it's impossible to keep up with, mulch. Now, what you want to do is you want to weed first. If you haven't weeded yet, you want to get those weeds out, and then you want to add mulch if you haven't yet. My favorite mulch is wood chips for this purpose. It lasts a long time. You put it on there and it's really good at suppressing weeds. I like leaf mulch for just the overall condition of the soil. I feel like it does really well in the soil, but there's some drawbacks to leaf mulch, especially early in the season. The roly-polies, pill bugs, they tend to love it, which is not great for young seedlings, but for mature ones, they're fine. Straw is another good option. Sometimes straw can come with its own weed seeds, so you have to lay it on thickly. That's why I really like wood chips. But it just depends also what you have on hand. But the point is to mulch so that the weed seeds are not going to have the ability to sprout, because they're not going to be able to get to the light when you've got 2 to 4 inches of mulch on your garden space. Mulch also, though, serves as a benefit to your plants because it helps conserve moisture, especially when we are getting into the heat of the summer and maybe the rains aren't coming as frequently, or even if they are, the temperatures are so high that the plants are using more water. They're also getting larger. Mulch is going to help conserve moisture in the soil. It's also going to help regulate really heavy rains. Many of us do get downpours, and mulch is going to help prevent the heavy splashing on our soil. It will help prevent disease spores from splashing back onto our plants, but it's also going to help moderate the heavy amount of rains that gets into the soil and possibly could be too much rain for the roots of our plants. So mulching is something, if you haven't done it yet, I recommend get that in place as soon as possible. Also, keep an eye on some of your heavier feeding crops like tomatoes, corn, squash, and fertilize them if necessary. We're going to be talking about fertilizing in a couple of weeks, and we're going to go more in detail into that. I admit I've not ever really fertilized a whole lot this time of year, but I'm starting to see that there can be some benefits depending on my bed and depending on the crop. But especially container plants, if you are watering, and at this time of year, you're going to start to probably water daily. That's a lot of nutrients that's getting flushed. They're going to need nutrients to replenish them. Those roots can't go anywhere else. They don't have extra soil to grow into. They've got what's in that container. So you might want to consider a regimen that is fertilizing every 1 to 2 weeks. I probably wouldn't do every week. I think that might be a little bit much, but look at your crops to see. But every couple of weeks for container plants. And then again, we'll talk about fertilizing more in a couple of weeks. So stay tuned for that. But definitely have that as something in your mind to fertilize, especially if you start seeing your plants are just not growing at the pace that they should. They may need some extra help with fertilizer. Another thing is, hopefully you have already staked your tomatoes or put a tomato cage on them or trained them in some way, or even your vining crops like your pole beans or your cucumbers. But if you haven't yet, make sure that they are being supported, that they are growing up. Cucumbers in particular do need a little bit of help to train on whatever trellis that you have for them. Pole beans, as long as they're pretty close to something that they can twine around and circle around, they're usually good on their own. But some other crops like your cucumbers, like your vining squashes, you may need to train them a little bit. And even your tomatoes may need to be trained. This is also the time of year if you are pruning your tomatoes, whether you're pruning them because of disease or you're taking the suckers out of them, just depending on how you're growing your tomatoes. Keep an eye on that because they're growing really fast. So you want to keep them in the shape that you want them to be. If you're growing flowers, then I know this is not a fun thing to do, but deadheading spent blooms, the ones that have already bloomed and faded, get them off the plant. Not only is it going to be prettier to look at if you don't have to look at a bunch of spent blooms, but it also sends a signal to that plant to continue producing new blooms. So that would be a great thing to do for flowers and even herbs. Once your herbs flower and those flowers fade, especially perennial herbs, I'm mainly talking about perennial herbs like your chives and your oregano and peppermint, get those out so it'll make room for new blooms. It also makes it prettier, not as unsightly having these spent blooms. I just walked back to take a look at my chives, and those beautiful chive blooms are just all like done, and the pollinators, they're done with them. They need to be taken out. So that's just one of those things. It's not fun to do, but if you're out there and you just want a chance to enjoy a nice evening, that's one of those things that you can do to spruce up your garden. And then if you have a compost pile, keep it turned. You may want to add some water to it to keep it moist, just because if you don't get rain this time of year, compost to break down does need moisture. I don't know that I have ever actually watered my compost pile, just because that was not a priority. But as I'm scaling back my garden, I actually have time to do maintenance tasks like I've never had time to do before. So if you have a small garden, this is something you could have time to do. And if you keep your compost pile moist, it's going to break down quicker, which will basically mean you'll be able to use your compost faster. All right, the next thing let's talk about is monitoring. This is actually kind of a fun task because it requires you getting out of your garden and walking it, not necessarily doing anything, but just observing. The first thing you want to observe is, are there any slow-growing plants? And try to figure out why. This is something that I've had people ask me about. It's come up twice within the last week that friends have shown me their gardens and they've said, why aren't my plants growing faster than this? They should be growing more, especially if they look and see like the rapid rate that my plants are growing. And I will tell you that what I found in both of those cases, I mean, within a week, and in different places. One was a garden I visited in Staten Island in New York. And while I was in New York, I got a text from a friend back here in Arkansas. So it could happen anywhere is what I'm saying. In both of those cases, I saw a lot of bark content in their soil. And what happened most likely is they bought what they thought was good compost even, or soil, but it was probably in a bag. And a lot of times there's a lot of bark content in those soils. And that's not a bad thing in the long term, because that bark will break down into a good soil medium. But in order for it to break down, it needs nitrogen. And guess what else needs nitrogen? Our plants. And so what's happening is that bark is taking up that nitrogen and the plants aren't getting it. So if that's the case, if you're noticing that there's slow growing plants and you look at the composition of your soil and you're like, oh, that's a lot of bark, I can see the pieces, then I would recommend a nitrogen fertilizer of some sort. You can do a fish meal, you can do blood meal. There's lots of different options, especially if you're an organic gardener. And again, I'm going to go over all of this in a couple of weeks, but if you're noticing this right now, then you might research that right now to try to help to give those plants a boost. The next thing you want to monitor your plants for are going to be pests, because if we can get on top of pest outbreaks early, then we're going to have a better shot at controlling them and managing them as compared to waiting until they have gotten out of control and it's just a losing situation at that point. You want to monitor pests like squash vine borers, aphids, obviously cabbage worms. I mean, there's all sorts of them. We're also going to be talking about common pests. I think it's next week or the week after, maybe the week after. But anyway, we're going to be talking about that. But monitor for signs early so that you can take action early. For example, with cabbage worms, you may be noticing them on your brassicas, your broccoli, your cabbage. Even I've seen them even on my lettuce. But you want to take action early, spray or hand pick, spray with BT, Bacillus thuringiensis is an organic spray. Hand pick, do what you can. But for any pest infestation that's gotten out of control, you may need to take out the plant altogether. And this is what I have to do with squash bugs, because no matter what I do, squash bugs are really hard to keep under control. They reproduce so rapidly, and they don't have the natural predators that like aphids do. Aphids reproduce very rapidly, but they have natural predators that tend to take care of it, like ladybug larvae and syrphid fly larvae and lacewing larvae. Those are all over my property, so I don't really have trouble with aphids long term, but squash bugs is really hard. So sometimes I have to just look at the squash plant and look and say, this is out of control. It is better for me to remove this plant, get rid of these adults before they have a chance to reproduce even more. And also, if a plant is being attacked to a significant degree, it's not going to be productive for you. You may notice that a squash plant that's attacked by squash bugs, why isn't it producing? It's not giving me squash anymore. And so if that's the case and it's too far gone, take it out, replant it. I'll be talking about that more in the future as well as we talk about pests in a future episode. But that's one thing you want to consider. Is this infestation something I can handle right now? Like, can I get a hold of it and handpick every single day like I've done with harlequin bugs or harlequin beetles and Japanese beetles? I've done that and trying to keep them where their damage is limited. Or do I just need to take out the crop because it's too far gone? Another thing you want to do is watch out for signs of disease, especially fungal disease, and remove affected leaves. This is, in my garden, most common on tomatoes, where they start getting these brown spots and they eventually turn yellow. This is either early blight or septoria leaf spot. Basically, they're two different diseases, but they have the same repercussions. So taking those affected leaves out as soon as possible. So watch for signs of disease that start to come on early. Now, we will be talking more about diseases and pests in an upcoming workshop. Our summer workshop is on June 17th. This will be focusing on pest prevention, pest control, disease identification, and how to make healthy plants or develop healthy plants that are more resilient to these things and even resilient to heat and other stressors in the summer. So mark your calendar. I don't have a place for you to get your ticket quite yet. That will come next week, but June 17th at 7 p.m. Central is our next workshop where we're going to talk all about that. So hopefully you can have a healthier garden this year despite all the challenges that are going to be coming your way if they're not there yet in your garden. Okay, the final thing let's talk about is keeping an eye on your irrigation and your watering. If you haven't yet, check your irrigation systems, check your timers, check for leaks, make sure that there's not any major leaks. I know that's the one thing that's easy for me to do is just set it and forget it, put the timers on, and then somebody happens to be out in the garden and they see a geyser. Usually it's my drip lines. Usually that's where the leak is. Usually my drip lines or my drip tape. Thankfully, with the Garden in Minutes garden grids, I have never had any problem with that. It definitely is more of a set it and forget it. But there have been many times that I did not realize that a leak was happening. And especially when it comes to drip lines and drip tape, you have a leak and that takes the pressure, like it affects the pressure. So nothing else is getting watered at the rate that it needs to be watered. So take a look at that. Make sure it's all functioning properly. Another thing you want to do is adjust how you're watering as we get into the heat. So you want to water, especially for these mature plants, you want to water more deeply and you want to water consistently, but more deeply for these larger plants. Not necessarily an everyday thing. I mean, you might, but you want to make sure that you're not just watering the surface because you want the water to get down deep into the root zone and then continue going where the roots are encouraged to go deeper to find more moisture. Because if you water just like shallowly but frequently, the roots are not going to have any reason to go deeper to be able to withstand drought, also to be stronger to withstand winds during the season. So watering more deeply is important for these more mature plants. Now, if you are planting something like lettuce in the middle of the summer and you're sowing seeds, those need to be shallow and more frequently, obviously. But the bigger plants, adjust those to be more deeply. And then monitor your container plants for drying out faster in the heat, because when the heat comes, they're going to dry out quicker. The plants themselves are going to be larger. They're going to need more water. So you may need to water them every day as we get into the heat of the summer. With containers, I recommend, putting your finger into the soil, doing a test, make sure you're not overwatering. A moisture meter is helpful, but not required. But definitely monitor container plants. They're going to need more personal attention during the summer. They may not require as much as far as weeding goes, but they're going to require more when it comes to watering. So keep an eye on those, especially as we head into the warmer parts of the year. I hope you enjoy this June as much as I enjoy June. I know that between May and June are usually the best times of year for me in the garden. I know in Arkansas that may be different compared to where you're at. But I hope that this has been helpful to put some things on your mind, on your radar, to get you prepared for your own garden. And if you can stay on top of most of these things, then hopefully your July and August and beyond will be just as enjoyable. And then you're going to start getting a lot more harvest and hopefully not as overwhelmed as many of us gardeners can be at the end of the season. So I hope that this was helpful for you. Thank you so much for joining me today. And make sure you're subscribed to the podcast, because we'll be back again next week for more garden topics that hopefully will be relevant for you in your garden. I appreciate you so much. I know you have choices of where you listen to podcasts, and I hope that you have found this helpful in your garden. Have a wonderful week.